Hello, my friends. Welcome to an all audiobooks edition of Friday Reads here on Lindy's Magpie Reads. If you're new here, I'm Lindy. I read a lot. And as I said, today it's all about the audiobooks. I do have physical books. I mostly borrow from the library. I'll make other videos talking about those things. But before I get to books, knitting. Well, a knitting book, sequence knitting. This is by Cecelia Campochiaro. And it's a particular technique of knitting that I am finding so fascinating. I'll show you all the things I've been making lately. There's a hat. And a whole series of hats, all done with the same sequence of knit and purl, but a different number of cast-on stitches. So knitting and purling can give you ribbing like this. I made myself a little gnome hat. But if you add one extra stitch, so 61 stitches, this is the pattern. So look how different they are. Same sequence of stitches, but adding one extra one so that the repeat as you knit around changes. This hat, by the way, I had dyed the yarn with amber cherry bark. And then here are two that are dyed with dandelion. And this one had 62 stitches and this one had 63 stitches. The two different colors from the dandelion is because I changed the pH to get the brighter color. And then this is the same 62 stitches, but done with cochineal. I had done a dye study using different techniques of dyeing with cochineal, including dipping it in iron to get this purple, which is also how I got the purple on this shawl that I'm wearing. This is 64 stitches, and the yellow is goldenrod, and then this is also goldenrod but dipped in indigo. 65 stitches, so it's the very same sequence of knit and purl stitches. And the colors in here are from marigold and marigold plus iron. Yes. And 66 stitches. So this is a natural sheep color plus a little bit of yarn that I had dyed with indigo. I just had so much fun with those. And I've already showed on a previous video, this is also from the book, and this hand-spun yarn I got from an auction at my fiber guild. So what I've been doing is going through my stash and having fun with these patterns in the sequence knitting book. On to what I've read recently. Shade, the Promise of a Forgotten Natural Resource. This is by Sam Bloch, and the audiobook was read by Shawn Jain. I heard about this book on the 99% Invisible podcast quite a while ago. So it wasn't yet available to me at that time, but in the 99% Invisible podcast, they particularly talked about small shade that was attached to bus stops to provide enough shade for one or two people in Los Angeles, a city that's notorious for not having shade. So the author is a humanitarian aid entrepreneur, and he talks about how important shade is for human health and other living creatures as well, and especially with our world heating up. He starts out by talking about the world's oldest cities and how the wisdom of shade was known then. So 4,000 years ago, a traveler who was crossing a marshy plain might have seen a ziggurat in the distance. Massive walls on this structure were 200 feet across. So this is an aspect of architectural design, to have really thick walls to help control temperature, keep heat out, or keep heat in when it gets cold out. To have the walls oriented so that, where the direction of the sun, it casts the maximum amount of shade. And actually, this is how the very center of Los Angeles was when it was first built up by the Spanish missionaries. In another chapter, he talks about the invention of air conditioning and how this really changed modern city design. So, for example, tall office buildings have windows that don't open. There's no longer awnings to shade interiors from sun coming in. And we know that air conditioners generate heat, they use a lot of energy, and so when it's hot out and we all want to stay cool, that's when it's more likely to have a failure on the energy grid, and then the interior of buildings can become dangerously hot. Studies have shown that if you spend a lot of time in air conditioning, you become more sensitive to heat, and you are more likely to die of heat if you can't get into an air-conditioned space when it's hot out. It's really interesting how our bodies can adjust. When I spent 4 months in Sri Lanka when I was a teenager, I remember that initially I found it so hot and humid, and then within about a week, I felt like my body had adjusted and I was no longer dripping with sweat, even though the temperature was the same. But at Christmas time, the Canadian participants in this Canada World Youth Program went to the High Commissioner's for Christmas Day, the Canadian High Commissioner, and it was an air-conditioned house. And then it took me 2 days after that to readjust to being in hot weather again. And it's true that older people are less able to make adjustments like that. Well, that's something to think about. When it comes to heat, Sam Bloch writes that there's no deadlier place to work than a farm. Field hands and crop pickers are 3 times more likely to die of heat exposure than construction workers, for example. And then in the final chapter, he talks about some pretty outlandish solutions, including shooting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere in order to create shade. And this is something that I first heard about in one of Elizabeth Kolbert's books, Under a White Sky. There are many questions still outstanding about these sorts of practices and how they might affect different parts of the globe if we start messing around with the stratosphere. So, speaking of other parts of the globe, I'm here in Victoria, British Columbia. This next book is set in Australia. In Australia, they have really done a lot to promote protection against the sun. I've seen children in swimsuits that cover their arms and legs. I've seen playgrounds there with sunshades. This is also talked about in Sam Bloch's book. And the slogan, slip, slop, slap, which is a mnemonic that I think has been around for a long time now in Australia and maybe in New Zealand as well. Slip on a shirt, slop on some sunscreen, and slap on a hat. Protect yourself from the sun. So the book that I listened to is The Sitter by Angela O'Keeffe. And I found it in my library's Hoopla collection. So this was after Shawn on Shawn Breathes Books talked about it on his channel. He said he was going to pick it up for the Ben Reads Good challenge on Storygraph. Read an Australian book for February. So I've done the same thing. Well, I listened to the audiobook, and this is a short one. It's only about 4 hours long in audio, short and sweet. It's set in Paris at the start of the COVID pandemic. So just as things are almost closing down in 2020, the central character is a writer. She's an art critic. She's writing a book about Hortense Cezanne, so Paul Cezanne's wife. And the novel is actually told in the voice of Hortense. So it's like she's a ghost who's haunting the writer. And at one point, the writer is talking to her daughter on the phone about the book's progress. And she says, she set it aside. Everything's changed now. People are dying, rushing to get across borders. All sorts of things are happening. And the book just seems an extravagance. And at this point, I was reminded strongly of Maria Reva's book, Endling, which is, if you're not familiar with it, a novel that switches to nonfiction on account of real life political upheaval, the war in Ukraine. And Angela O'Keeffe does something a bit similar. Maria Reva said something along the lines of how our world is changing so much that novels are just aching to break out of their mold and become something different to accommodate our current reality. I love it when there is this serendipity of books that I've read before or books that I'm reading concurrently that kind of speak to each other. And this novel, The Sitter, opens with an epigraph from Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. And this is the line: shade, too, can be inhabited. And in the novel, we see that the writer has this book with her, and she remembers a time when she was talking to one of her brothers on the farm. They grew up on a farm outside of Brisbane, about that particular book and what that line means. Literature is something that's understandably important to this writer. And she goes to Shakespeare and Company. She's in Paris the day before it closes down for the pandemic, and gets an advance reading copy of a book that I have also read, Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency. And that one is by Olivia Lang. So, once again, I could add my own prior experience in this case of reading that book, to this writer and what she's going through as she's thinking, okay, I've got to change my flights, I've got to get home, I know there's going to be quarantine once I get back to Australia, you know, all of the mundane things, but there's also other things going on from her past that she's writing about when she starts writing something different. And I love how she talked about when she was writing about herself in the past, it was like it was a different person. And, you know, I could totally understand that because, yes, we're the same body, but over the years, we change so much that when we look back on ourselves, it is, in a way, like we were a different person. Yeah. And another thing that I could connect with in this book is that the writer has a shawl with her, one that she's had since she was in her teens, and it was her mother who knitted it for her. And she remembers her mother saying that wool is really special, and even when it's wet against your skin, it can keep you warm. This is true. This is true. And this is one of the reasons why I love wool. So I'm not going to tell you anything else about The Sitter, except to say I enjoyed it very much. So glad to have read it. But I'm making a connection with wool in this next book. Wool and ancient Sumer. Weavers, Scribes, and Kings. A New History of the Ancient Near East. And it's by Amanda Podany, with the audiobook read by the author. And the author is a history professor, and she's also done a Great Courses series on ancient Mesopotamia, and I have watched some of those. I am so interested in ancient Mesopotamia. I have been for years. There's something about the pottery in particular that just makes me feel happy. I love looking at it. It's the first place I go in a museum that has Mesopotamian pottery. Love it. So this history covers a vast sweep of times, starting with the very first cities, pretty much in the world, and going up to the time of Alexander the Great. The focus is on the daily lives of people and the way that people were able to figure out what daily lives were like back then is because of cuneiform tablets. So this form of writing is preserved because it's in clay, as opposed to writing on papyrus or skins or paper. And these tablets recorded production of textiles made from wool from 15 different types of sheep, each identified with their own pictogram. Over time, cloth became one of the major exports of Mesopotamia. So their most important natural resources were the sheep and goats that grazed in the hills. And they used the flatter, more arable land for growing crops. So these wool workers, so the spinners, dyers, weavers, embroiderers, they created luxury fabrics that were in much demand. They could be traded for other things like gold and silver. In one chapter, she's talking about ancient Levant, which is present-day Syria. And in the 24th century, before the Common Era, Ebla was one of the earliest kingdoms there. The king of Ebla owned between 80,000 and 136,000 sheep. A thing that you might not know is that before the end of the Bronze Age, sheep didn't continuously grow wool, so they weren't sheared annually. Instead, they shed their wool seasonally, so they were plucked. So imagine you've got thousands and thousands of sheep, and you need thousands of workers to pluck this wool in the spring when it starts shedding. Just so many amazing things. Now, this is just one aspect that I'm telling you about in this book of ancient Near East history. There's plenty of other fascinating things to find out in there. And back in September of 2025, I listened to another great audiobook about the ancient Near East. Between Two Rivers, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History. This one is by Moudy Al-Rashid. And the audiobook, again, read by the author, who is from Saudi, and I think she teaches in the UK now. So this is, Mesopotamia was between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Once again, so much information from cuneiform writing, which the author can read in a couple of different languages, including ancient Sumerian. So this area is now Iraq. And the book opens with a dig at the city of Ur in the 1920s, when they found a collection that made it seem like this was possibly an ancient museum, because the pieces that they found there were from different times and different parts of the world. Well, within that area, but I think as far away as Egypt. These excavations were done after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the clay tablets, like I was saying about the previous book, have so much day-to-day information, economic and administrative, but also beer recipes, lullabies, stories like the Tale of Gilgamesh, many copies of those stories, and they've even found the messy writing of students who are just learning how to print in cuneiform. They found tablets that have dog paw prints in them, or children's bite marks, doodles created with fingernails. And I learned that the earliest named author was a woman. Enheduanna was a prolific poet and also the high priestess to the moon god in Ur, 4,500 years ago, in the 2300s BCE. I like the way that Moudy Al-Rashid really focuses on women's lives in this book. And I actually used it for the Ben Reads Good Challenge in 2025. September was Read a Book with a Blue Cover. And this was one that I haven't told you about yet. But of course I thought of it when I read Amanda Podany's book. And for some reason, Ben from Ben Reads Good keeps coming up in this video that I'm making, because he was the one that actually convinced me to read this next book. The History of Sound Stories by Ben Shattuck. And in the audiobook, it's a brilliant production. it has got a whole bunch of different narrators, so a different one for each of the short stories. And then one of the stories is actually a created Radiolab podcast. And in the audio production, it sounds like you're listening to Radiolab with multiple people talking and contributing like they do on that show. Ben Shattuck is also a museum curator and artist, a painter, I think. And art and collections come up in these stories, including in one story, what these men are doing is going around from town to town collecting and recording folk songs that people are singing. The stories are paired, so we'll see past and present. Sometimes the present is still historical, but closer to our present time. And so, for example, in August in the Forest, there's a writer in residence who finds a newspaper clipping, and it recounts the mysterious deaths at a lumberjack camp in 1907. All of these stories are set in New England, and so this was in New Hampshire, so everybody was found dead, and he's really wondering about it. Well, the very next story is in the form of a journal written by one of the men at that lumberjack camp. So as a reader, we get to find out what happened. And as it happens, in that journal, so that's called the Journal of James Thurber, he talks about one of the other men there at camp who comes from Harrisville. And right around the same time that I was listening to this audiobook, I also was listening to an episode of the Long Thread podcast that was interviewing Chick Colony, who started a textile business in Harrisville, New Hampshire. It was like so weird. So I will link that podcast down below, and also the 99% Invisible podcast about shade for your listening pleasure. The Radiolab story in here is about a sighting of the great auk that happened in Newfoundland. And then the next story is set in Newfoundland. And this is a story where the author got something wrong. And that was in a passage where he is despairing about all of the hospital bills that his wife has incurred. Months of medical bills were fanned out on the kitchen table like a hand of losing cards. He's asking, what happens if I just don't pay? Now, this is 1991. Newfoundland was a part of Canada at that point. We have universal health care, and there is no way that he would have been burdened with hospital costs. Yeah, that was like a quibble. I thought the author could have done a better job there of finding things out. I suppose it's possible that he's talking about a Newfoundland and a Halifax that's in New England in the US, and and Labrador. I mean, I'm pretty sure he's talking about Canada here, but I could be wrong. I might be unfairly disparaging Ben Shattuck's writing here. I'm not disparaging the book. I loved it. It's fantastic, and I highly recommend it. And that's all I've got for you today for this Friday Reads. So Thank you so very much for watching. I always love to hear from you, so please do say hello in the comments and let me know if you've read any of these, and let me know if you are as fascinated as I am by the ancient Near East. Yeah. Happy reading, everybody. Bye for now.